first one, as Pratik mentioned, was working on Eclipse plugins for folks that have been in development long enough to be familiar with Eclipse, which was a pretty popular Java IDE going back a ways. Thanks a bunch, Pratik and Pankaj, for inviting me, and the GDG Hyderabad group for hosting me. It's awesome to be here to talk to you all. I hope everyone's doing well and staying healthy. I've been lucky to stay healthy so far, although I'm getting a little bit tired of being stuck at home, but just chugging along. I was also lucky enough to be in Hyderabad and Bangalore last year. Got to meet some of you in person, which is awesome. I hope to travel out there once the restrictions are lifted. I really enjoyed that trip and meeting all the developers out there using Firebase and building interesting stuff. I'm dialing in from Menlo Park, California, so it's 8:30 a.m. I work in San Francisco. And with that, we can just jump into it. So we can check in on the agenda. We'll talk about continuous integration, delivery, and deployment. And spoiler alert, these terms might not mean quite what you think they do. At least that was the case for me when I started looking into these things. CI/CD is often referred to as a tool. And while tools are important, it's not sufficient. It's also a development philosophy that your team can practice. We'll talk a little bit about developer workflows that enable you to achieve continuous deployment and the branching strategies that factor into that. We'll talk about feature switching a bit. We'll talk about the test, release, and monitor flow, which is so important to delivering a stable experience when you're practicing continuous deployment. And then we'll talk a little bit about Firebase tools and how you can achieve continuous deployment using Firebase. So in continuous integration, all of your code that's under development is merged back to master regularly, integrated and tested all together. It is a bit more than just having a tool set up to do automatic builds. At this point in time, people have gotten pretty used to having a CI system that does automatic builds for them. But in order to really practice continuous integration, there's a little bit more than just setting up a tool. In order to do continuous integration, everyone needs to be merging back to master regularly. They may create branches, but those branches should be as short-lived as possible. If they live for very long, you aren't fully realizing the value of continuous integration. And doing testing on your development branch is not sufficient. Even if you pull changes in from master, yeah, Pratik, did you have something?
Steve, actually, people are not able to see the screen. I would request all of you to pin the screen of the Steve which he's sharing, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you'll pin the screen, you'll be able to see the slide as well.
I just brought it back up. There we go. It should be pinned for everyone, hopefully now. You see it?
That works. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. Great. I was mentioning that you definitely want to keep your branches as short-lived as possible. And testing on a development branch isn't really sufficient, because even if you pull in changes from master, the other developers in your team that are making changes aren't testing their changes against the work that you have in progress on your branch. Continuous integration encourages smaller change set size. Merges are easier, bugs are found earlier, and build breakages are easier to fix. So a common litmus test that's applied to determine whether or not you're achieving continuous integration is if you have your testing running on every commit, and all of your developers are merging their code under development back to master at least once per day. Continuous delivery takes it to the next step of the process, where you have automation that will build a binary that you're able to push to production at any time. So those binaries are being built on a regular basis, and all of your automatic testing is running against it. Having that build that's ready to go at any time enables developers on your team, QA, or other folks within your company to grab those builds and test them at any time. And those builds can be fed into automation that will then take them all the way out to production. So this practice requires your team to prioritize keeping software deployable over new feature development sometimes. Otherwise, your code base may end up being really unreleasable for long periods of time. And if that's happening, then you're not really achieving continuous delivery. And because continuous delivery requires an integrated build, it's dependent on having continuous integration set up. And the final piece of the puzzle is continuous deployment. So which is getting those builds out to your customers in an automated way. For web or server development, that might mean deploying on every commit. In mobile development, there are two ways you can get your code out to customers or users for validation. You may do internal deployment, so you create a build that's consumed by testers within your company, or you might do external deployment using a tool like Firebase App Distribution or TestFlight to get that build out to external testers. And having this practice in place helps companies shorten their time to market so they can deliver value to their customers more quickly. Your code base needs to always be releasable, and practicing continuous delivery will allow you to achieve that. And because you're shipping often, there'll be small differences between your releases, which helps you really debug issues more quickly. So to recap, continuous integration is when your code is integrated and tested regularly and in an automated way. Continuous delivery is when you automatically produce a build that's ready to deploy. And then continuous deployment takes that build all the way out to customers. So you might be thinking, if people are checking into master every day, and that's going out to customers, how can that work if some of the features are under active development and they're not quite ready for customers to use yet? So let's talk about the difference between deploying and releasing. When you're deploying, that means your customer has access to a new binary. And when you're releasing, it means the customer has access to some new behavior or new feature within your app. So oftentimes these end up getting coupled together because you ship a binary out, it's got a new feature in it, and people get access to it immediately. But you don't need to couple behavioral changes in your app to shipping a new binary. And if you can do that, it really reduces risk in shipping your app. With a decoupled approach, in the first phase, you deploy that new binary out to app stores. And then later on, once it's rolled out, you can actually manage the release after that new feature is in production, but it's being hidden. In order to hide it, we use a practice called feature switching, which some of you may be familiar with. And that allows us to hide that new code from customers until it's ready for them to use. And we'll come back to that in a little bit more detail in a bit. So what's really great about this approach is that it allows developers to own their feature all the way into production. An anti-pattern that you may hear from time to time is, it works for me. A developer built this code, they tested their machine, submitted it, and they consider their job done. And how many times have you ended up seeing this scenario where a feature gets merged, a developer moves on, but then eventually when that code makes it into production, a bug is found, and then the developer has to move off of the new work they're working on. It leads to a lot of unnecessary context switching, and it can really be a pretty big drain on developer productivity. Also, when there's that handoff from developers to somebody doing a release, there's a loss of awareness of the business value of the work that they're doing because the developer themselves aren't tracking success metrics and the customer experience of that feature all the way into production. But with continuous deployment, done means released. It means that feature is all the way out to customers and being used. But a short deployment cycle is critical to be able to achieve this. Otherwise, developers can't wait around. If it takes too long to get that work out into production. So you really need a short deployment cycle in order for this to happen. So an important thing to think about when you're trying to adopt continuous deployment are your development workflows. So let's switch gears a little bit, and we'll talk about branching strategies that allow us to achieve continuous deployment. And we'll start with a counterexample, an approach that really doesn't work for continuous deployment. So this one is long-lived branches. In long-lived branches, you create a branch to do your feature development on, and you stay on that branch for the entire time you're developing that feature. That could be weeks or months or more. Who knows? It can really take quite a while depending on the size of the feature. Thankfully, this used to be more common in development, less so now. In this approach, usually you're doing most of your testing on the branch itself, so in isolation from all the other changes that are happening in your app that are happening on those other branches. The advantage of this is that builds can continue when one branch is broken. But that's really pretty much the only advantage. There are a whole sort of array of disadvantages that come up. You end up with a painful and scary merge back to trunk when you're done with that feature development. it's pretty hard to know how long that merge will take. And oftentimes you can end up with several features trying to merge back right before release, which can put the release itself at risk. It's pretty complex and risky, causes bugs, and it's pretty time consuming. Another thing about this approach is that it reduces team collaboration because folks, working on these long-lived branches aren't working with each other on any sort of regular basis. Refactoring becomes quite difficult because it makes merging back to trunk so difficult, which means that code quality deteriorates over time. It's also much harder to share common code with this approach. And in this approach, continuous integration is impossible. Remember, continuous integration requires that all code under development is being tested together. So another approach is trunk-based development. With this approach, changes are always merged directly into trunk. We use feature switches in order to hide the new behavior from customers while it's under development. And advantages to this, it breaks up that huge merge that you would have had at the end of that long-lived branch and makes it really small and regular so that it's less painful. This allows for a code base that's always releasable from trunk. And refactoring, in this case, becomes tractable since developers have access to all of the code that's under development. The downside to this is that build failures become a big deal, right? When the build's broken, nobody can get work done anymore. But that's not necessarily a terrible thing. Developers come together when this happens, get the build fixed, and typically, implement some new practices or tooling which make those build breakages less likely to happen in the future. This approach requires teammates working together closely and regularly. Code review becomes a synchronous process, which means you might need to do something like pair programming or some other approach that sort of enables developers to review each other's code before it's checked in. And this approach is compatible with continuous integration since you're merging back to master on a regular basis. So the last branching strategy I'll talk about are short-lived branches, which you may have heard referred to as GitHub flow. With this approach, we're no longer merging directly to trunk. We do create branches, but these branches exist for much less time. We're merging them back to master much more often. We probably only have a couple of commits on a branch before it's merged back. Like trunk-based development, we're going to use feature switches to hide the new code until it's ready to expose to customers. And we maintain many of the advantages that we have with trunk-based development with this approach as well. Like we can still do refactoring since most of the code that's under development is on trunk, and since the branches are so short-lived, we're integrating all of our code back to master pretty regularly. And if we're using Get, we can use tooling to facilitate code reviews, which will allow developers to work a little bit more asynchronously. They don't necessarily have to get together to do code reviews. They can rely on that tooling to make it a little bit easier. But some anti-patterns can creep up with this approach. It can be pretty easy to let a branch get out of control and go on for many commits. And if that happens, then this starts to look a lot more like long-lived branches, right? So your team needs to, they need to prioritize code reviews. So it's just there's some team practices that you need to work out to sort of make sure that you don't fall into those anti-patterns. And if those anti-patterns are kept in check, then this approach is compatible with continuous integration. All right, so we want to achieve continuous integration because it increases code health and it decreases developer toil. And we want to achieve continuous deployment because it allows us to get value to customers more quickly. But if we're merging small changes to master and shipping from master regularly, we need to be careful that we don't prematurely expose new code to customers. We'll need to use feature switching to enable us to control which of those changes are affecting the customer experience. And if we do this right, there's no need to hand off to a release manager. The person who develops the feature can control the rollout itself. Feature switching, if you're not familiar, is essentially just a fancy if statement in your code and some way to control the behavior of that switch from the back end. Feature switches are valuable operationally, allowing you to maintain control of the feature that you're working on in case anything goes wrong while you're rolling it out. But they can also be pretty useful for achieving business goals. For example, if you want to expose a feature to only a certain segment of your user base, Or if you want to maybe time it with a marketing release, like you want to ship, get some new features out in your binary, but then hold off on exposing it to customers until some sort of marketing announcement goes out, for example. Okay, so we've covered the basics at this point, but there are a few critical parts of the workflow when you're doing continuous deployment that you want to keep in mind in order to maintain stability of your app. With the long-lived branch approach, you'd build from a branch and you test there, but now our builds are coming from master. So we've got a bunch of features that are under development, hidden by feature switches, and we need a way to enable those feature switches for our testers. There are a couple ways that we can achieve that. One way is that sometimes developers will create test builds where all of the flags are hard-coded to be switched on so that testers just have access to everything. But maybe a more common way is to maintain a whitelist of testers that have access to particular features. And with a bonus of this approach is now those testers are testing in a fully integrated environment. They're no longer testing in the isolation of just one branch with the long-lived branch approach. So since we put our feature behind a flag in order to hide it from customers during development, we also now have control over that feature when it's in the production app. With the traditional deploy, the feature is released with the binary. And who hasn't experienced a disaster because of this? You ship your app and then you discover an issue that's affecting your entire customer base. And you have to race to prepare a fix and hope you can get it approved in the App Store quickly to mitigate that impact. It's a pretty painful experience for those that have gone through it. But if we use feature switches, we can slowly roll it out to customer. We can observe the behavior of our backend as we're increasing the load of that new feature. It gives us the ability to limit damage if anything goes wrong. We're able to roll it back, turn it off if we need to. It also gives us the ability to do product validation and collect feedback on the feature. If we want to do a particularly slow rollout, we can enable it for just some of our production base and try to gather feedback before we enable it for everybody. But we'll need to have good visibility of the behavior in the feature, of that feature in the wild for this to work. And that brings us to the next topic, which is monitoring. So if anything goes wrong in production, you'll want to be aware of it. Since we're shipping often, we'll have small change sets, and it'll be easy to fix things if they go wrong. But we need to know that something's wrong. And this really starts from the beginning, before development of the feature. You want to make sure that you're tracking all of your success metrics in for this new feature that you're shipping. And in addition to feature success metrics, you should also be monitoring on general business metrics like revenue and retention, things that you want to have your eye on all the time, as well as factors that impact the overall experience of your app, such as performance or stability. Okay, so why don't we chat a little bit about what it can look like to apply some of these practices with Firebase. So for folks that aren't familiar, Firebase is a suite of connected services and tools that solve many of the common challenges that mobile and web app teams have. You don't need to roll your own solutions for things like feature switching. You can rely on us to provide those solutions so you can focus on what's special about your app instead of building that common tooling. We provide tools that help you build your apps, like backend as a service solutions, like Cloud Functions and Cloud Firestore. Tools that help you deliver a stable app, like Crashlytics and performance monitoring. And tools that help you provide an amazing experience in your app that'll help drive user engagement, like analytics, A/B testing, and messaging. Firebase is in use by over 2 million apps. And those apps range from small startups up to large enterprises. This is just a small selection of apps that are using us. There's probably some names in here that you recognize. Hotstar and Swiggy are a couple of companies I talk to pretty regularly. And Firebase has a lot of products that'll help you build great apps. But the ones I want to focus on today are the ones that are really foundational to building continuous deployment into your workflow. So now that we've covered the concepts of continuous deployment, let's round out a workflow in Firebase that allow us to achieve continuous deployment. Here I've broke it down into the following steps: develop, deploy, test, release, and monitor. So this is simplifying things a little bit. As you can imagine, this isn't really entirely a linear process. Some of these things, sort of apply across the life cycle. For example, monitoring, really becomes useful as soon as you hit that testing step. But this is, hopefully simplifies things a little bit to make it a little bit easier to digest. So let's start by taking a look at how you can use remote config to set up feature switches in your app. You can think of remote config as a key value store that lives in the cloud. And we can use those values to dynamically configure how our app will behave. Here's an example of how we'll make a call in our app to grab the configuration from remote config. As you can see, there's just a few lines of code to do this. We'll make a fetch call to remote config to grab the values. And when we're ready, we'll go ahead and activate those values when we want to start using them. Having that activate step gives us control over when the new values apply in the app so that you can stay in control of when the behavior will change based on that new configuration. And this is how we use the flag once we've got it pulled down. Hopefully no surprises here. We just grab that value from remote config, and then we can use it like a standard Boolean value. And we use that to decide whether or not to render a new feature for this customer. But remote config can do quite a bit more than just basic feature switching. It allows targeting values at particular user segments, like region, language, analytics audiences, custom user properties that you can set up in your app. Remote config gives developers the power to maintain control of the experience that they want to deliver without shipping a new version of their app to the App Store. It makes it easy to build defaults into your app for safety if network connectivity is an issue. It provides an asynchronous API, so you can stay performant. You can block if you need to have those values available before you start your app, but if you don't, you can rely on the asynchronous API to have a quick startup. It's cross-platform with Android, iOS, and web support, so you can synchronize the experience across all of your apps. And remote config is proven out at scale. Right now, we have over 4 billion app instances around the world that are fetching configurations from us. All right, so we've got our feature flag in place, and now you can imagine we've run a build through CI, and now how are we going to get it deployed for validation? That's where Firebase app distribution can come in. It gives us the ability to ship a build to our internal and external beta testers, which will help get us the confidence that we need to know that our build is good before we release it out to our customer base. You can use the Firebase CLI to automatically upload builds to app distribution and have those builds sent out to customers. This is a screenshot of the Firebase console where several beta releases are being tracked. You can integrate distribution with CI to have it happen automatically, or you can use the console to manage those releases if you prefer. There's also a Gradle plugin and Fastlane support if you prefer to use those tools. Here's an example of how you invite testers to try your beta builds. And once that's set up, you can set out new builds automatically. After that, testers can download and install your app, and you can start collecting data about how that build's performing and get feedback from your testers on how that new feature you have under development is working out. All right, so we've got a build that's gone out to testers. How are we going to enable those new features that are in development for those testers? Remember, so we're doing our builds from master in this scenario, so there's probably a variety of features that are under development in this build that we're going to deploy. We need to identify testers somehow and enable a flag for them so that they can test those particular features in this build that we've made. So remember that remote config has some powerful targeting functionality. One way that we can get access for testers is to use version targeting. If we have a version of our build that they should have access to that everyone should have access to this new feature, we can enable that feature for this new version that we've built. But another way to do it is to target on user properties. User properties in Firebase are a way to set an arbitrary key value pair in your app. And then you can enable flags based on the contents of those properties. For example, you may set a user ID in your client. And then you can use the value of those user IDs in the clients to enable the feature for a whitelisted set of testers. This practice is also pretty useful once your app is in production if you want to enable a feature for testing after you ship a new version. Okay, so we've deployed a new build to our testers, and let's imagine they've tried it out. We've gotten that build validated, and we've decided it's good to go. So let's fast forward a little bit. Excuse me. Let's fast forward a little bit to after we've shipped that build out to the app stores. Remember, in this case, we're separating the deploy and the release steps. So now that the version is in production, it's time to enable that feature switch for your customer base. We'll go back to remote config. If we want to do a typical percentage rollout, we can make use of remote config's percentage condition, or you can target the release at a specific audience if you wish, or even mix the two. Managing our release with remote config means we'll have the ability to roll the feature back if customers are negatively impacted in any way. For example, if we see crashes, or if we see other key business metrics that are falling. You can also do a rollout using A/B testing. You may not immediately think of A/B testing for a basic rollout, but it can be a pretty useful approach. With this approach, you create two variants. A is control with the flag off, and B will be with the flag on. We can set a percentage exposure or target a particular segment, just like we would in remote config. But using A/B testing will give us additional visibility into metrics while we're doing the rollout. And the final piece of the puzzle is tracking the feature in production to make sure that it's healthy. So these services provide out-of-the-box monitoring for important aspects of your app. They'll help you keep an eye on your app's stability, performance, and business metrics. Let's start by taking a look at Crashlytics, which helps you keep tabs on your app's overall stability, as well as identify and fix crashes. This is a screenshot of the Crashlytics dashboard. It gives you a glanceable view of your overall app stability with crash-free users percentage, as well as a list of issues ordered by impact. So it can help you figure out which issues should be addressed first. If you click through on one of those issues, you'll get a stack trace that'll help you debug it with additional details about the device, where the crash occurred, as well as analytics events that led up to the crash to help you figure out what caused that crash to happen. In addition to stability monitoring, Firebase can also help you stay on top of performance issues with performance monitoring. You just need to drop in the SDK for iOS, Android, or web, and it'll automatically start tracking many performance statistics about your app. Things like start time, the performance of network calls in your app, and which screens are taking a long time to render. You can also drill into those issues to get a breakdown of some of the attributes that might be contributing to the performance issue, like device type. Performance monitoring also lets you instrument custom tracing if you want to dig in further than the standard measurements provide. You also want to keep an eye on your business metrics as you roll out new features, and to help with that, there's Google Analytics. It'll help you understand things like how many users you got in the last month, week, or day, which conversion events they're hitting the most often, how much time customers are spending in your app and where they're spending the most time, how much money you're making in your app across in-app purchases and ad revenue, and if there are any problems in the latest release of your app. Those built-in metrics are really great for getting an overall look at how users are interacting with your app, but there's likely a variety of behaviors you'll want to track in your app to get a deeper understanding. So you can use Google Analytics to measure custom events in your app as well. You can use those custom events to build an audience that you can then use in remote config for targeting on your feature flags. All right, so just to wrap it up, continuous integration makes developers' lives easier by reducing the overhead of merging and testing your code in an integrated environment. And continuous delivery and deployment makes it super easy to get builds out, which shortens the amount of time it takes to get value to your customers. Feature switching is an important pattern through this that enables developers to own their own work all the way into production. And the good news is you don't have to build your own tools to accomplish all this. Firebase will be there to help you out. I hope you try out some of the things we talked about today. If you do, connect with me on Twitter. Let me know how it's going. Or drop into our Firebase Slack. I'd love to hear from you all there. Thanks so much.
So, guys, if the questions are there, we'll be taking that as well now. Steve, are we okay to take the questions?
Yeah, for sure. I can bring up the chat. Let's see.
Yep. The first question is from Shiva Prasad. He asked how to manage version in Firebase functions.
So I'm a little bit less familiar with Firebase functions. Let's see, how do you create dev and prod environments? Typically, the way we advise managing environments in Firebase, a pretty nice way to do it that provides like a good level of safety is to create entirely different projects for your different environments. So you might have like a project that that you use entirely for your dev testing, and then a separate project you use for production. With Cloud Functions, you can copy those functions across the projects when you're ready to sort of update from development to production. You can do so similarly for remote config. For some products, it's a little bit easier to manage, honestly, than others with this approach. And it is something that we're sort of actively working on trying to improve to make it easier to manage multiple environments in Firebase.
Then the second question is, what's the best way to deploy a machine learning model?
I'm less familiar with that. I wonder if maybe any of our GDEs are familiar.
Pankaj, if you can.
Yes, so one thing is that we have MLKit service, and MLKit offers this capability where anyone can host their custom trained model. Either use the model which Firebase offers, or if your use case is really not matching with whatever Firebase is offering, then convert to the TF Lite model and host it on the MLKit service. And then they have an SDK, so you can download it on the fly or keep it with your app. So MLKit is the service for doing this work.
Okay, then I guess that Harsh, your answer, you got the answer. He got it. Okay. Then there's a question from Mani Kiran. He says, how to do temporary deploy each PR on GitHub and remove after merging?
Interesting. Remove after merge. So this would be like a deploy for the PR.
Mani, if you want to elaborate your answer, you can unmute yourself and you can ask the question.
Yeah, I think Steve got my question. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. I think that makes sense. Yeah, certainly. I would imagine a lot of folks here are using some sort of CI tool, like TeamCity or Jenkins. I know GitHub has integration with those tools where you can do automatic builds for a PR, on every commit. As soon as you got to commit to a pull request, it'll do a build. And I imagine you could hook up that the builds for that branch directly into, using Jenkins. You could probably automate a deploy into Firebase app distribution. You'd definitely be doing a lot of deploys at that point, but there's no reason why you couldn't set that up.
Mani, is it okay for you? The answer satisfies your question, or you have something else to add?
Yes, Pratik. But okay. I think, and with other tools only we can do it, right? Like instead of hosting it to the primary domain, like I wanted to do it a temporary domain where I can see the changes, and then later onwards, if everything looks fine, then I can merge that PR.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think the key integration point would be in your CI system, where you want to like push that build to somewhere where you can grab it to test.
I mean, this may not be very specific to Firebase, but in my experience, I've seen people have done the branch build and the PR build both gets deployed to a different environment altogether. So it doesn't really messes up the production environment and doesn't really overwrite your URL. So, or in GCP, what I've seen is they deploy it to a version, but no traffic goes there. So the version endpoint is very unique to the developers, and they can test it offline in the in isolation, and then when the PR gets merged, it goes to master, and it gets the full traffic 100%.
Okay, cool.
Then there is a question from Neil itself. How quickly the remote config gets reflected? Do we poll or it pushes the changes immediately?
Right. Remote config is a fetch model, like a polling model. So in the SDK, when you configure it, you can decide at what points in your app you want to do that fetch. So we really leave it in the developer's control in terms of like how often they want to fetch the configuration. So that we don't, we're not making too many network calls or anything. And you can also, there's also a local cache. By default, it's set to last for 12 hours. So if you do another fetch, it'll actually hit that local cache instead of going to our server. But that cache expiration is fully configurable, so you can turn it down to a shorter period of time if you need to be fetching new values more frequently.
Okay. And Neil, is that
Yeah.
okay for you?
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. So the next question is from Abhishek Agrawal. He asked, how is remote config different from the other cloud pipeline services?
Yeah, I think one thing that makes remote config pretty unique is the level of integration with Firebase as a platform. So it has deep integration with Google Analytics. So something that our customers will do a lot is that they will end up targeting remote config values based on segments that they build in Google Analytics. So you may have, for example, if you set up like purchase events, for example, in your app, you can then use remote config to target configurations based on customers who have previously made purchases in your app. And this can give you the power to really customize your app experience based on actions that our users have taken in your app in the past.
Okay. Abhishek, does that answer satisfy your question? Oh, thanks. Okay. Okay, so I guess if anybody else is having question, they can unmute themselves and ask the questions directly if they want. Steve, meanwhile, they are thinking about the question. There's one thing. Okay. Hello. Hello. Okay. If I guess your voice is not clear, you can type your questions. No issues. So Steve, I was asking, there are a few students who also join the meetup most of the time, and what happens is like they want to know how do they should be learning about the skills and the stuffs that they are coming in. So what do you, how can you help them in making these things getting learned from the scratch or from the very basic? How do you suggest them to go on from here if they are new to this?
Yeah, I'd like to new development in general.
Yep.
Yeah, I think often one thing I really recommend folks doing is find an open source project to contribute to. There's so many interesting projects out there, and I think oftentimes folks maybe feel a little bit intimidated by sort of just diving in and sending PRs. But I think oftentimes the open source maintainers really do appreciate those, and you'd be surprised how often they'll be happy to engage with you and chat about your ideas. So that's one approach. Another one is just building an app, right? I think a lot of us do that. I've done it in the past. Just find something that interests you. One thing I did when I was first getting into app development, I was really into Reddit. I would spend a lot of time on Reddit, and I found that I loved looking at pictures on Reddit, but the Reddit site itself wasn't really optimized for picture consumption. So what I did was I sort of built like what was essentially like a cross between like a photo browser and a Reddit client. And so you can kind of like subscribe to subreddits and like just flip through pictures very easily. And it really kind of took off. Like at its peak, I had 25,000 active users using it. So it was like a really fun experience. Just find something that interests you and build it and get it out there.
Okay. How do we want to follow up? Like I have few questions from the previous session. Okay, there are a few questions coming in now, flowing in. So how is the integration with the Firebase and GitHub Actions? What are all we can automate in Firebase with GitHub Actions?
That's a great question. I'm only a little bit familiar with GitHub Actions. I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine you can sort of integrate with external services using GitHub Actions and make calls into their APIs. Many of Firebase's services have public APIs we expose. For example, in remote config, we have an API that you can use to manage your configuration if you need to make updates for it. So like something that sometimes folks will do is they will integrate with their CI so that they sort of copy over like the latest version of the config when they're doing additional builds to update version targeting and things like that. And so you should be able to integrate those with GitHub Actions, like integrated into our public APIs.
Okay, Karthi, does that answers your question, or you have anything else to ask? You can please type or unmute yourself for the same. Yeah, thanks. Okay, that answers your question. So Steve, what do you say? Do you want something else to be shared from your end?
That's about it for me. Yeah, I mean, if folks do have more questions, like definitely feel free to connect with me on Twitter.
Yeah. There's like I'll share the Steve's Twitter. Steve, if you can ping your Twitter link there on the chat, so that people can directly go and check it out. There's one more thing that we'll be more than happy if you guys can know the topic that you are looking forward for the Firebase or GCP, so that we can plan another session maybe in a week or two of next month, so that it will be helpful for all of us to know what's the agenda or the requirement from you, so that Steve can also be prepared with stuff as well. And similarly, if you have any suggestions for the topic in GCP or MLAI, that is also welcome. Please share us that as well. If you want to type that on the chat, we'll be more than happy to take in.
Prateek.
Yeah.
So one thing which I would like to say is that if Steve could cover something about the pricing also, because those who have the Firebase, they've never tried Firebase, they want to get started with Firebase, like remote config, analytics, and because there are so many services that are free of cost.
Yeah.
So it will be easy for them to get started with this.
Okay. So do you like Steve to answer, or you want to answer that one as well? Any of you? It's basically any of you can answer that.
To cover something for remote config or any other services?
Pankaj, you're breaking up a little bit, so I'm not sure I heard the entire question, but if it was about sort of getting started with Firebase, yeah, we could totally chat about other, I know one thing that we do sometimes is we run code labs to sort of just like walk through setting up some of the products. Might be something fun to do. We can chat more.
I guess, Neil, are you there on the call? Neil?
Yep.
There's one question, I guess, for you. Suggestion: Neil discussed on GCP build for each PR for temp link, only for the developer to view those links. What is it?
Okay, no, Mani, do you want to
ask some question, or it's
yeah.
He wrote suggestion. I'm not pretty much sure what could he do.
I think Pratik was discussing for the upcoming sessions, like anything.
Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah. So
sure.
Okay. Great.
So there was one more question, Steve. Does the integration can support for Flutter mobile apps?
Yeah, Flutter, we have some support for Flutter. We're working on expanding that for sure. If you look around, there's actually quite a bit of third-party support for Flutter and Firebase. So yeah, give it a try. If you see something that's missing, I'd love to hear about it, because we are sort of prioritizing which services we want to try to make easier for Flutter. So let me know how it goes. And also following up on what Pankaj said, I think he was mentioning about pricing with Firebase. And I think one thing I didn't mention is that like many of the services we provide with Firebase, most of the ones I talked about today are entirely free. Remote config is free, Google Analytics, app distribution. So yeah, it's pretty easy to get started. You won't have to pay for those services. Our backend as a service tools do have a cost when you get a certain level of usage, but many of the growth products are free.
Okay, I guess we are done with the questions. Yeah, I guess it's more than sufficient, and we are done before 10 minutes. It was a patient crowd today. So anything else, if anybody wants to share, please, you can unmute yourself and chat directly to us. We can take 5 more minutes.
And I would say it's a great opportunity for all of you, because Steve is here, who is working directly in the team.
You don't get a person who is directly coming from the team of the Google itself talking to you that frequently. So please utilize this 5-10 minutes that you have. I guess they might be thinking, or they might be searching. It's a new place also for the people to actually interact. I don't know how shy they feel about asking the questions.
Hello.
Yes, hello. Yes, who's this?
So yeah, I'm Sai. Hello everyone.
Hi.
Basically, my uncle sells some medicine niche only for sugar patient. So what I've done is I've built a UI part with React.js. I just don't know where to grow from him. I have added cart and some basic medicines. So want to host it somewhere I've heard is Firebase only for apps or even websites?
So
And can anyone
okay.
elaborate
So basically, you have a very good stuff that is called web hosting. You can actually go there directly and host, and you just have to pull up few lines of code which is already available. You just have to go copy them, paste it in your console where you have your project. Just put your build into it, and just type Firebase deploy, and your code will be deployed with an HTTPS. You'll get that thing works free for each day. You'll get a data of about 1 GB, which is more than sufficient for the beginner app. And even if you want to move ahead or you have a lot of traffic coming in for the website, you can take the other bundle, which costs you about $25, and it will give you an access of 100 GBs. 10 GBs for the same. So you can use it for even longer or large number of crowds. Like directly, you get scaled up directly by paying $25 a month.
Steve, do you have anything to add?
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. Maybe the only thing I would add is it also integrates really well with Cloud Functions. So if you do need to build more of a dynamic app, you can host your content on hosting and then integrate it with Cloud Functions.
Yeah. So Neil, if you also want to say something, if you can deploy somewhere else like container or something, if for this.
Yeah, my favorite is App Engine. If it's a totally web-based project, App Engine, go for it. And in fact, if it's very simple Docker container that you want to make it generic for future proofing it, just a Docker container, generic Docker container, then you can go for Cloud Run, which is also a good option for any HTTP-based services. You can just host that page. The total portal may be quite complicated, quite overwhelming for Cloud Run. You have to see App Engine Flex or Standard, but if you're looking for something free, App Engine Standard or Cloud Run, just look up these two things. I think there was something follow-up from the original question.
So Sai, there are you have 3 to 4 options. First was the App Engine, as Neil said. Then there's a Cloud Run. Then there is the web hosting from the Firebase itself. And one more thing I just missed. Did I miss something? I guess 3 are there. Any final? Yeah.
Okay.
So any final
Thank you.
questions?
Look into it.
Any final questions, guys, or we'll just leave? I guess we don't. Okay, Steve, thanks for being with us or bearing us for 1 hour.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was fun.
And looking forward to have some other sessions. So maybe people would be sharing us the feedback as well. We'll be sharing the form with them. And we'll be sharing the recording. Let me just check with the others as well. And then we can forward the same. Okay, guys, thanks for joining us. Have a good night and good morning to Steve.
Thank you. Bye all.
Thanks, Steve.
No problem.
It was a great session.